The dog led a homeless Navy SEAL into the mountains. What they found exposed a 30-year lie. No one survived. After 30 years away, a homeless Navy SEAL returned to the burned ranch everyone said was worthless. The house was in ruins. The town laughed at him, and the past still haunted his dreams. But his loyal German shepherd kept staring into the forest as if someone was watching. Then, one stormy night, the dog vanished and returned with proof that someone had been hiding in the mountains since the fire that destroyed everything. Comment 1 if you would return home no matter how much time had passed, or 0 if you would never look back. And tell us where you're watching from. The road into the Bitterroot Mountains looked older than Mason Reed remembered. Cracks split the faded asphalt like scars across weathered skin. Tall weeds pushed through the gaps, reclaiming ground that people had long ago abandoned. The mountains stood silent on both sides of the narrow road, their dark pine-covered slopes reaching toward a sky washed pale by late afternoon sunlight. Mason tightened both hands around the steering wheel of his battered pickup truck. The engine rattled. The dashboard shook. Everything about the vehicle reminded him of its owner. Old, tired, still moving. Beside him sat Titan. The German shepherd's muzzle had turned gray with age, but his eyes remained sharp. His ears stood alert as they always had, scanning the world beyond the windshield. For nearly 10 years, Titan had been Mason's only constant companion. Not a wife, not a child, not a friend, just a dog. And somehow, that had been enough. The truck climbed the final hill overlooking the valley. Mason felt his chest tighten. For a moment he considered turning around. Nobody would blame him. Nobody expected him to stay. Hell, nobody expected him to come at all, especially after 30 years. The valley opened before them, and there it was. The ranch. Or what remained of it. Mason slowly eased off the gas. His truck rolled forward as if even the machine itself was reluctant to continue. The property stretched across hundreds of acres beneath the shadow of the mountains. Once it had been one of the proudest ranches in the region. Fields had covered the valley floor. Horses had grazed the pastures. The farmhouse had stood strong against the endless Montana winters. Now it looked like a graveyard. The farmhouse roof had collapsed inward. The barn leaned to one side. Fencing lay scattered across the fields like broken bones. Nature had spent 30 years reclaiming every inch. Mason swallowed hard. The sight struck him with far more force than he had expected. He had spent years imagining this place, years dreaming about it while sleeping beneath bridges, years remembering it while sitting alone in shelters, years wondering whether coming back would finally quiet the ache he carried inside. Instead, the pain only seemed larger now. Titan let out a soft whine. Mason reached over and scratched behind the dog's ears. "We made it, partner." His voice sounded rough, unused. Titan nudged his hand. The dog seemed happy. Mason wished he felt the same. The ranch gate appeared ahead. One side hung crooked from a rusted hinge. The wooden sign that once displayed Reed Family Ranch had fallen into the grass decades ago. Mason parked beside the entrance. The engine died. Silence followed. Real silence. Not city silence. Not shelter silence. Mountain silence. The kind that seemed alive. For several moments neither man nor dog moved. The wind whispered through the pine trees. Somewhere in the distance a hawk cried. Mason stared across the property. 30 years. 30 years since the wildfire. 30 years since everything changed. The memories came whether he wanted them or not. Flames, smoke, screaming cattle, his father's voice shouting orders, his mother's terrified face illuminated by orange firelight. The wildfire had swept through the valley with impossible speed. Entire ranches disappeared overnight. Families fled with whatever they could carry. Some returned. Some rebuilt. The Reed family never did. His father couldn't bear it. His mother never recovered from losing the only home she'd ever known. Within a few years, they had both become strangers living in a city they hated. Then they died, one after another, carrying their heartbreak to the grave. Mason remained behind. A man without roots, a soldier without a war, a son without a home. The years passed. The military became his escape. The Navy gave him purpose. The SEAL teams gave him brothers. Combat gave him something to focus on besides grief, until eventually even that ended. Retirement came, then loss, then loneliness, then homelessness. One bad year became 5. 5 became 10. Only Titan stayed. The German Shepherd had entered Mason's life as a military working dog, assigned to support veterans suffering from severe PTSD. What began as assistance became family. Titan never asked questions, never judged, never left. Mason opened the truck door. Cold mountain air rushed inside. It smelled like pine trees, dust, earth, memories. He climbed down slowly. Age had stiffened his joints. Titan jumped out beside him. The dog immediately began exploring. Nose low, tail steady, focused, working, always working. Mason smiled faintly. Some habits never disappeared. He grabbed his worn duffel bag from the truck bed. Everything he owned fit inside. A few clothes, some tools, old photographs. The folded American flag from his father's funeral. Not much, but enough. The town of Elk Ridge sat only 15 miles away. The people there already knew he had returned. News traveled quickly in places like this, especially ridiculous news. Earlier that morning, he had stopped at a diner before driving into the mountains. The reaction had been exactly what he expected. Laughter, disbelief, pity. An old rancher named Buck Harmon had actually laughed loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "You're throwing your life away, Mason." Several others agreed. "Nothing left up there. That place is dead. You'll be back in town within a week." Mason hadn't argued. Maybe they were right. Maybe this entire trip was foolish, but something inside him had refused to stay away any longer. The ranch called to him. Not because it made sense, because it mattered. Sometimes that was enough. He walked slowly toward the farmhouse. Each step stirred old memories. There was the cottonwood tree where he used to climb as a boy, half dead now. There was the old water pump. Rust covered every inch. There was the porch where his mother once sat shelling peas on summer evenings. Only fragments remained. The closer he got, the heavier his chest became. The house looked smaller than he remembered. Sadder. Like an aging relative nobody visited anymore. Titan suddenly stopped. Completely stopped. Mason noticed immediately. Years of working beside military dogs taught him how to read subtle changes. This wasn't curiosity. This wasn't distraction. This was focus. The German Shepherd stood perfectly still. Every muscle tightened. Ears forward. Eyes locked on a single point. Mason followed the dog's gaze. The collapsed barn, nearly 200 yards away. The structure leaned dangerously to one side. Parts of the roof had caved in. Shadows filled the interior. Nothing moved. Nothing that Mason could see. Yet Titan continued staring, unblinking. The fur along his neck slowly rose. A low rumble vibrated deep inside his chest. Not a bark, not a growl, a warning. Mason's pulse quickened. "What is it, boy?" Titan didn't move. The dog never took his eyes off the barn. Wind swept across the valley. Grass rippled. A loose piece of metal on the barn roof rattled softly. Then something happened. For just a fraction of a second, a shadow moved inside the barn. Mason froze. His military instincts immediately sharpened. The movement had been small, quick, gone almost instantly. But it had been there. Someone, or something, watching. Titan took one cautious step forward, then another. The dog's focus never broke. Mason slowly set down his duffel bag. The loneliness that had accompanied him throughout the journey suddenly gave way to something else. Curiosity, unease, a feeling he knew well from years in dangerous places. The feeling that eyes were already on him, that he wasn't alone. The ranch had seemed abandoned, dead, forgotten. Yet Titan clearly believed otherwise, and Titan was rarely wrong. Far across the property, the ruined barn sat beneath the fading Montana sun, silent, waiting, watching. And for the first time since arriving, Mason Reed realized the people in town might have been wrong about one thing. The ranch wasn't empty. Something was still here, and whatever it was, Titan had found it first. Mason stood motionless in the fading light, staring toward the ruined barn. The shadow he had seen was gone. Only darkness remained beneath the collapsed roof. The wind drifted across the valley, carrying the scent of pine needles and dry grass. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called from the treetops. Titan never moved. His eyes remained fixed on the structure. The old German shepherd looked less like a retired companion and more like the military working dog he had once been. Focused, alert, ready. Mason felt a familiar tightening in his chest. The sensation had nothing to do with age. It came from old instincts. Instincts developed over years spent entering dangerous places where uncertainty could kill. He slowly bent and picked up his duffel bag. Easy, partner. Titan flicked an ear but didn't break his stare. The sun was sinking quickly behind the western mountains. Whatever waited inside that barn could wait until morning. At least that was what Mason told himself. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching. He carried his belongings toward the farmhouse. Each step took him deeper into the remains of his childhood. The porch groaned beneath his boots. A section of railing collapsed the moment he touched it. Dust drifted through the evening air. The front door hung crooked from a single hinge. Mason pushed it open. The smell hit him immediately. Old wood. Ash. Time. The house felt frozen, as though 30 years had passed everywhere else but somehow skipped this place. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor. Pieces of the ceiling had collapsed inward. Dead leaves had blown through shattered windows and gathered in silent corners. Moonlight spilled through gaps in the roof. Mason slowly walked from room to room. The kitchen, the living room, the hallway. Every space carried memories. Painful ones. Beautiful ones. The kitchen table was gone, but he could still see his mother standing beside the stove. He could still hear her laughter. The living room fireplace remained intact, though soot stained the stone. He remembered Christmas mornings, family dinners, winter storms, life. All of it gone. The loneliness settled heavily over him. For years he had imagined coming home. Now that he was here, the emptiness felt almost unbearable. Titan finally entered behind him. The dog moved cautiously through the house, sniffing, listening, investigating, not relaxing, not settling, investigating. Mason noticed. That bothered him. Titan usually relaxed the moment they found shelter. Not tonight. Tonight the dog acted like he was searching. Mason found an old wooden chair that remained mostly intact. After brushing away dust, he lowered himself onto it. His joints protested. The day had been long. The drive longer. Titan lay nearby but kept his head raised, watching, listening, waiting. Outside, darkness slowly swallowed the valley. The mountains disappeared into black silhouettes. Cold air slipped through broken windows. Mason opened his duffel and removed a flashlight, a blanket, and a small photograph. The photograph showed 3 people: a younger Mason, his father, his mother, all standing beside the ranch house, happy, before the fire, before everything fell apart. He stared at it for several moments, then carefully returned it to the bag. His eyes drifted toward the broken window. The darkness outside felt deeper than normal. He couldn't explain why. Maybe it was simply the isolation. Maybe it was memory. Or maybe Titan had sensed something real. The old dog suddenly stood. Every muscle tightened. His ears rose. Mason followed his gaze. The barn. Again. Even from inside the house, Titan couldn't stop watching it. Then the dog released a low growl. Mason immediately stood. "What is it?" Titan moved toward the doorway. The growl deepened. Not fear. Warning. Mason grabbed his flashlight. His pulse quickened. For several seconds he saw nothing. Then movement. A dark shape crossed between the barn and a nearby stand of trees. Gone almost instantly. His breath caught. Someone was out there. Or at least something large enough to cast a human-shaped shadow. Titan moved forward. Mason placed a hand on the dog's neck. Not tonight. The German shepherd resisted. Just slightly. Enough to make his point. Whatever was outside interested him deeply. Eventually, Titan backed down, but only because Mason asked. The dog returned to the center of the room, yet sleep never came. Not for either of them. Hours passed. The wind rattled broken boards. Tree branches scraped against the walls. Several times Mason woke suddenly, heart racing. Each time Titan was awake, watching, listening, guarding. Around midnight, Mason drifted into an uneasy sleep. And immediately, the dreams returned. The desert, the gunfire, the explosions, men screaming for medics, the smell of smoke, always smoke. The nightmare shifted. Suddenly, the battlefield became the ranch, the wildfire, orange flames racing across the valley, his father's voice shouting, his mother's terrified face, the sound of crackling timber, the feeling of helplessness. Mason jerked awake, breathing hard. Sweat covered his forehead despite the cold. For a few moments he couldn't tell where he was. The ruined house, the darkness, the broken walls. Everything blurred together. Titan was already beside him. The German shepherd pressed against his leg. Steady, solid, real. Mason lowered a trembling hand onto the dog's head. The panic slowly faded. It always did. Eventually. PTSD was like carrying an invisible wound. Some days it barely hurt. Other days it reopened without warning. Titan had pulled him back from countless dark moments over the years. Tonight was no different. Good boy. The dog remained beside him until his breathing returned to normal. Outside, silence returned. But not completely. A sound drifted through the darkness. Soft. Faint. Almost impossible to hear. A footstep. Mason froze. Titan heard it too. The German shepherd immediately rose. Both man and dog turned toward the front doorway. Another sound. Crunch. Like boots pressing against dry grass. Then nothing. Mason grabbed the flashlight. Moving carefully, he stepped onto the porch. The beam swept across the yard. Nothing. The barn stood motionless beneath moonlight. The fields stretched empty toward the forest. The mountains watched from beyond. No movement, no people, no animals. Yet the feeling remained. Someone had been there, watching, waiting. The rest of the night passed slowly. When dawn finally arrived, pale sunlight spilled across the valley. Mason stepped outside with a cup of coffee brewed over a camp stove. Titan immediately began another inspection of the property. The dog moved straight toward the barn. Again, as if pulled by an invisible thread. Mason followed. Morning light revealed details hidden by darkness. The barn looked even worse up close. Sections of the roof had collapsed entirely. Weathered boards hung loose. Tall weeds surrounded the structure. Yet something caught Mason's eye. Tracks. Fresh tracks. He crouched, studied them carefully. Boot prints. Not old. Not weathered. Fresh. Very fresh. Someone had walked here recently, more than once. His pulse quickened. The tracks moved around the barn, then disappeared into taller grass. Past beyond, Mason slowly stood. Titan was already investigating another area. The dog sniffed intensely near the rear wall, then looked back toward Mason, almost as if trying to show him something. Mason walked over. More tracks. Smaller this time. Lighter. Different. Not the same person. At least two individuals. Maybe more. The realization sent a chill through him. This ranch wasn't abandoned. Not entirely. Someone had been here. Recently. Frequently. Possibly still. Titan suddenly moved away from the barn and trotted toward the tree line. Then stopped. His body turned toward the forest, toward the mountains beyond. The German shepherd stood there silently, watching, listening. The morning wind stirred his silver fur. Mason followed his gaze. The woods looked peaceful enough, but beneath those towering pines, anything could be hiding. A person, a family, a secret. 30 years earlier, the wildfire had destroyed lives throughout the valley. Perhaps not every story had ended the way people believed. Titan released a quiet whine. Not fear, not warning, something else. Expectation. The dog seemed certain of one thing. The answers weren't inside the ruined house. They weren't inside the town. They were somewhere beyond the trees, and sooner or later, Titan intended to find them. The old German shepherd stood motionless at the edge of the forest, staring into the endless wall of pine and cedar that covered the mountains. Morning sunlight filtered through the branches. Golden beams danced across the grass. The valley looked peaceful. Too peaceful. Mason Reed had spent enough years in dangerous places to know that appearances meant very little. Titan finally turned away from the woods and returned to the barn. The dog moved with renewed purpose. His nose stayed low. Every few feet he stopped to inspect another scent. Mason followed. The barn loomed above them like a wounded giant. Weathered boards groaned whenever the wind touched them. A portion of the roof had collapsed completely, allowing sunlight to spill through the structure in bright shafts. Dust floated through the beams like tiny ghosts. The place smelled of old hay, rotting wood, and something else. Something alive. Mason stepped carefully inside. The floor creaked beneath his boots. The silence felt strange. Not empty. Occupied. Titan moved ahead. Suddenly the German shepherd stopped. His ears snapped forward. A second later, a loud flutter exploded overhead. Mason instinctively reached toward the knife on his belt. Several birds burst from the rafters. Wings beat furiously through the dusty air. The unexpected movement startled both man and dog. Then Mason laughed softly. The first genuine laugh he'd allowed himself in months. Still jumpy, old man. Titan glanced at him as if disagreeing. The dog continued deeper into the structure. As Mason followed, something caught his eye. Fresh straw. Not old. Fresh. He crouched beside it. The golden color hadn't faded. Someone had placed it here recently. Then he noticed something else. Animal droppings. Recent. A lot of them. Mason slowly stood. His curiosity deepened. The mystery was becoming impossible to ignore. Titan rounded a stack of fallen boards, then disappeared from sight. A second later, Mason heard a low bark. Not aggressive, excited. He hurried forward and froze. A horse stood in the shadows. The animal watched him carefully. A chestnut mare, thin but healthy. Its coat glimmered beneath the shafts of sunlight. The horse didn't run, didn't panic, simply watched. Mason stared in disbelief. For several moments, neither moved. 30 years. The ranch had been abandoned for 30 years. Yet here stood a living horse. Titan slowly approached the mare. The animal lowered its head. Neither seemed threatened. The sight stirred something inside Mason. A strange warmth. Hope. The mare's ribs showed slightly, but not enough to suggest starvation. Someone had been feeding her. Someone had been caring for her. The realization sent another chill through him. This wasn't luck. This wasn't survival by accident. This was maintenance. The horse belonged to somebody, or somebody belonged to the horse. Titan suddenly moved again. He trotted toward the rear section of the barn. Mason followed. The surprises continued. Several chickens wandered among the debris. They pecked at the dirt floor, clucked softly, completely unconcerned by his presence. One hen fluttered onto a broken beam and stared down at him. Another disappeared behind a pile of lumber. Mason shook his head. Well, I'll be damned. The barn wasn't dead. It was alive. Everywhere he looked, life persisted. Life had claimed the ruins. Titan pushed through a gap in a collapsed wall. Mason stepped outside and entered a small clearing hidden behind the structure. His breath caught. A vegetable garden stretched across part of the clearing. Rows of carrots, potatoes, beans, tomatoes, everything carefully maintained. Everything thriving. Someone had planted this. Someone was harvesting it. The garden couldn't be more than a few days from its last tending. Mason slowly walked between the rows. The soil remained dark and moist. Fresh footprints marked several sections. Not old. Recent. Very recent. Titan sniffed around the perimeter. The dog seemed almost pleased, as if every discovery confirmed something he already knew. Mason crouched beside a tomato plant. The fruit hung heavy and ripe. A nearby bucket contained freshly picked vegetables. Whoever lived here planned to return. Soon. The realization changed everything. This wasn't an abandoned ranch occupied by wildlife. This was someone's home. Hidden, secret, invisible to the outside world. A sound interrupted his thoughts. A rustling noise beyond the garden. Titan instantly reacted. His head whipped around. The dog stared toward a stand of trees bordering the clearing. Mason turned. For a brief second, he thought he saw movement. A flash. A shape. Gone. Then silence. Titan trotted forward several yards, stopped, listened. Whoever had been there was already gone, or hiding. The mountains suddenly felt much larger, much older, and far less empty. The remainder of the day passed in exploration. Mason discovered signs of life everywhere. A repaired section of fencing, fresh axe marks on firewood, animal feed stored beneath a tarp, a water trough recently cleaned. The evidence accumulated steadily. Someone had been living on the ranch for years, maybe decades, and they were very good at remaining unseen. As afternoon turned toward evening, Mason sat on the farmhouse porch. The damaged boards creaked beneath his weight. Titan lay nearby. The dog appeared content, almost satisfied, as though progress had been made. The valley glowed beneath the setting sun. Golden light washed across the fields. The mountains stood dark against the horizon. Beautiful. Lonely. Mysterious. Mason opened a can of soup over his camp stove. Steam drifted into the cool air. For the first time since arriving, he felt something other than grief. Purpose. Questions. A reason to stay. The people in town believed this place was worthless. They were wrong. The ranch held secrets. Living secrets. As darkness settled across the valley, Titan suddenly stood. The dog stared toward the tree line once again. His body stiffened. Mason followed his gaze. At first he saw nothing, then movement. Several shapes emerged from the woods. Large, silent, watching. His pulse quickened. The figures stepped closer. Moonlight revealed them. Dogs. 4 of them. Mixed breeds. Lean and wary, half wild. They stood beyond the fence line and observed him from a distance. Titan remained calm. The pack seemed interested in him. Not hostile. Not afraid. One black and white dog stepped forward, sniffed the air, then retreated. The others followed. Moments later, they vanished back into the forest. Mason sat speechless. More evidence. More mysteries. The ranch seemed to exist between 2 worlds, part wilderness, part hidden community. Before he could fully process the encounter, another sound drifted through the darkness, a faint metallic clang. Far away, somewhere near the mountains. Titan immediately turned toward it. His ears rose. The dog listened intently. Then a second sound followed, a gate closing. Mason slowly stood. There shouldn't have been a gate out there. Not anymore. Most of the ranch fencing had collapsed decades ago, yet somebody had just closed one. Titan stared into the darkness. The old shepherd's eyes reflected moonlight. Focused. Certain. Determined. The mystery was growing larger with every passing hour, and deep inside, Mason felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Excitement. Not the excitement of danger. Not the excitement of combat. The excitement of purpose. The ranch had called him home. Now it was revealing pieces of a story nobody else knew. And somewhere beyond the mountains, someone was watching him discover it. Someone who clearly didn't want to be found. Yet Titan had already begun following their trail, and sooner or later, that trail would lead them both to the truth. The next morning arrived beneath a blanket of silver fog. Clouds clung low to the Bitterroot Mountains, wrapping the valleys in a ghostly haze. The ranch seemed suspended between worlds, half hidden beneath drifting mist. Mason stood on the porch holding a mug of black coffee. Titan sat beside him. Both stared toward the tree line. The dog had barely slept. Several times during the night, Mason had awakened to find Titan standing guard at the edge of the yard. Watching. Listening. Waiting. The old shepherd's instincts had never been stronger. Mason trusted them. More than that, he trusted Titan himself. The dog had saved his life more than once. In Afghanistan, in Iraq, and during countless dark nights after the wars ended. If Titan believed something was out there, Mason believed it too. The morning passed quietly. Mason spent several hours clearing debris from the farmhouse entrance, Broken boards, rusted metal, and shattered furniture slowly formed piles across the yard. The work felt good. Simple. Honest. Physical labor had always helped silence the noise in his mind, especially the memories, especially the nightmares. By noon, the fog began to lift. Sunlight spilled across the valley. The ranch seemed almost beautiful again. Then Titan froze. The change happened instantly. 1 second he was helping investigate the property. The next, every muscle locked tight. His ears rose. His eyes focused on something beyond the northern pasture. Mason immediately noticed. "What is it, partner?" Titan took off. The dog sprinted across the field, fast. Far faster than Mason expected from a shepherd his age. "Titan!" The dog didn't stop. Mason dropped his tools and ran after him. The chase carried them across open grasslands and toward the forest. The terrain gradually changed. Pastures gave way to dense pine woods. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the canopy overhead. Shadows stretched between the trunks. The air felt cooler here. Older. Titan disappeared around a rocky outcrop. Mason pushed harder. His lungs burned. His knees protested. Age reminded him of its presence with every step. Yet he continued. Something told him this mattered. When he finally reached the rocks, he stopped. Titan stood motionless. 20 yards ahead, near a narrow game trail. The dog wasn't looking at Mason. He was staring deeper into the forest. Mason followed his gaze and saw her. A girl, perhaps 14 or 15 years old, thin, long dark hair, wearing an oversized flannel jacket several sizes too large. For a brief moment she stood perfectly still between the trees. Their eyes met. Mason felt a shock ripple through him. She was real. Not a shadow, not imagination, not a trick of the light. A real person. The same figure he had glimpsed near the ranch. The girl looked frightened, not terrified, not panicked. Simply cautious, as though she had spent years avoiding strangers. Titan slowly stepped forward. The shepherd's tail wagged once, softly. The girl's expression changed, just slightly. A hint of recognition, a hint of trust. Then a branch cracked beneath Mason's boot. The sound shattered the moment. The girl's eyes widened. Without hesitation, she turned and ran. "Wait!" Mason stepped forward. "Hey! I'm not going to hurt you!" The forest swallowed her instantly. Titan bolted after her. Mason followed. Branches slapped against his jacket. Roots twisted beneath his boots. The trail wound deeper into the mountains. Several times he caught glimpses of movement ahead. A flash of dark hair. A figure slipping between trees. Then nothing. The girl moved through the wilderness like she belonged there. Mason could barely keep up. Eventually, the trail split. Titan stopped. The scent trail vanished among rocks and fallen leaves. The girl was gone. The forest fell silent once again. Mason bent over, breathing heavily. Titan searched the area carefully. Back and forth. Methodical. Military. Finally, the dog stopped beside a fallen log. Something rested on top. A small object. Hand-carved wood. Mason picked it up. A horse. Beautifully crafted. The detail was remarkable. Every line carefully shaped. Every curve polished smooth by hand. The carving looked old, frequently handled, important. The girl had dropped it while fleeing, or left it intentionally. Mason wasn't sure which possibility bothered him more. Titan sniffed the carving, then looked toward the mountains. The dog seemed frustrated, as if they had come close to something significant. Very close. The return trip felt longer. Questions filled Mason's mind. Who was she? Why was she hiding? How long had she been living out here? And why had Titan reacted as though he already knew her scent? Back at the ranch, Mason couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. By evening, he made a decision. He needed answers. The next morning, he drove into Elk Ridge. The small mountain town looked exactly as he remembered. One main street, a gas station, a hardware store, a diner, a church. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody else's business, or thought they did. Mason entered the diner. Conversations immediately quieted. Several locals glanced up. Some recognized him instantly. Others pretended not to. Buck Harmon sat at his usual booth near the window. The old rancher smirked. Back already? Mason ignored him. He approached the counter. A waitress named Linda poured coffee into a mug. Morning, Mason. Morning. He accepted the coffee, then lowered his voice. I need to ask something. Linda raised an eyebrow. What kind of something? Mason hesitated. A teenage girl. The waitress frowned. Whose girl? I don't know. Silence. Several nearby customers began listening. Mason continued. Dark hair, maybe 15, living somewhere near the mountains. The reactions were immediate. Confusion, shrugs, disbelief. Nobody seemed to know who he was talking about, or nobody wanted to admit it. Buck laughed from his booth. Only thing living up there is wildlife. Several people chuckled. Mason didn't. Something felt wrong. The denials seemed too quick, too rehearsed. As he finished his coffee, an elderly woman entered the diner. She moved slowly with a wooden cane. Silver hair framed a weathered face. The room greeted her warmly. Everyone seemed to know her. Linda leaned closer. That's Evelyn Parker. The name sounded familiar. Retired schoolteacher. Lived in Elk Ridge for decades. Mason remembered her vaguely from childhood. As he stood to leave, Evelyn unexpectedly spoke. You're Reed's boy. Mason stopped. Yes, ma'am. Her eyes lingered on him. Studying. Evaluating. Then they shifted toward the mountains visible through the diner window. For a long moment she said nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice carried unusual weight. Some things were buried for a reason. The room grew quiet. Even Buck stopped talking. Mason felt a chill. What does that mean? Evelyn sighed. The expression on her face looked older than the mountains themselves. Just be careful what you're looking for. Then she turned and walked away. No explanation. No answers. Only warning. The drive back to the ranch felt different. The mountains no longer seemed mysterious. They seemed protective, as though they'd been hiding something for a very long time. When Mason returned, Titan was waiting beside the porch. The shepherd immediately approached, tail wagging. But his excitement wasn't for Mason. It was for something else. Something he'd found. Titan grabbed Mason's sleeve gently and tugged. All right, all right. The dog led him around the barn, past the garden, toward the edge of the forest. Then Titan stopped, near the base of an old pine tree. Mason looked down. Fresh footprints, small, human, the same size as the girl's, only hours old. She had been there, watching the ranch again, watching him, watching Titan. Mason slowly looked toward the mountains. The evening sun cast long shadows across the valley. Somewhere out there, hidden among countless trees and endless ridges, a frightened girl was observing everything. And somehow, Titan was slowly earning her trust. The question was no longer whether someone lived in the mountains. The question was why they had spent so many years making sure nobody ever found them. And deep in the forest, beyond the fading sunlight, unseen eyes were still watching. That night, sleep refused to come. Mason lay beneath a patched blanket inside the ruined farmhouse while moonlight poured through holes in the roof. The mountains beyond the broken walls seemed endless beneath the silver glow. Titan rested near the doorway. At least he appeared to. The old German shepherd's eyes opened every few minutes, watching, listening, guarding. The same way he had done beside Mason's bed through countless nights filled with nightmares. Outside, the valley remained silent. Yet the silence no longer felt empty. Someone was out there. The girl. Perhaps others. And somehow they were connected to the ranch. Connected to the wildfire. Connected to secrets buried for 30 years. Mason stared into the darkness. His thoughts drifted toward Evelyn Parker's warning. Some things were buried for a reason. The words echoed through his mind. He finally drifted into sleep sometime after midnight. The dream came immediately. Smoke. Fire. The same dream he had carried for decades. He stood once more in the middle of the ranch as flames devoured everything around him. His father's voice shouted through the chaos. Run. Leave. Don't look back. But this time something was different. Someone stood beyond the flames. A figure. Watching. Waiting. Trying to speak. Mason woke with a start. His heart pounded. Sweat covered his face. For several seconds he couldn't breathe. Titan immediately moved beside him. The shepherd pressed his head against Mason's chest, grounding him, anchoring him to reality. Slowly the panic faded. The nightmare retreated. Morning eventually arrived. A cold mountain wind swept across the ranch. Clouds drifted low over the peaks. Titan seemed unusually restless. The dog barely touched his food. Instead, he wandered constantly around the farmhouse, sniffing, investigating, searching. Eventually, Mason followed him inside what remained of his father's old bedroom. The room had suffered less damage than most of the house. One wall still stood mostly intact. A rusted bed frame occupied the corner. Pieces of shattered furniture lay scattered across the floor. Titan began sniffing near the far wall. Then he scratched once, stopped, scratched again. Mason frowned. What is it? Titan pawed at the floorboards. The dog had found something. Mason grabbed a crowbar from his tool pile and knelt beside the spot. The boards appeared ordinary enough, weathered, dusty, forgotten. Yet Titan remained focused. Mason wedged the crowbar beneath one of the boards and pulled. Wood groaned. Nails squealed. A section of flooring lifted. Dust rose into the air. Beneath the boards lay a small hidden compartment. Mason froze. The space was only a few feet wide, carefully concealed, deliberately hidden. His pulse quickened. Inside rested a metal box. Rust covered much of its surface, but it remained intact. Titan sat beside him, watching, waiting, almost proud. Mason lifted the box. The metal felt cold in his hands. He carried it into the sunlight outside. For several moments he simply stared. This box had remained hidden beneath the house for 30 years. Perhaps longer. Finally, he forced the latch open. The hinges creaked. Inside lay a collection of items wrapped carefully in cloth. Photographs, letters, documents, and a worn leather journal. Mason immediately recognized the handwriting. His father's. His breath caught. For a long moment he couldn't move. The sight hit him harder than expected. His father had been gone nearly 20 years, yet suddenly he felt close again, as if time itself had folded backward. Mason opened the journal. The pages had yellowed with age. The first entries described ordinary ranch life: weather, livestock, crop yields, neighbors, nothing unusual. But as he continued reading, the tone slowly changed. The final months before the wildfire felt different, darker, more worried, more cautious. His father wrote about strangers visiting the valley, men asking questions, men buying land, men making offers nobody wanted. Mason turned page after page. The tension in the entries increased. Then he reached a section written only weeks before the fire. His father described several neighboring families suddenly disappearing. Not moving. Disappearing. Entire households gone without explanation. No goodbyes. No warning. Just gone. The sheriff never found answers. Neither did anyone else. Mason's stomach tightened. He continued reading. The final pages had been written shortly before the wildfire. The handwriting looked rushed, uneven, almost fearful. Then he found the final entry, the last words his father ever recorded inside the journal. Mason read them twice, then a third time. Someone survived, but they are too afraid to come home. The words sent a chill through him. He stared at the page, unable to look away. Someone survived. Who? One of the missing families? The girl? The people hiding in the mountains? Suddenly everything seemed connected. The wildfire, the disappearances, the hidden garden, the animals, the footprints, the girl. Titan nudged his hand. Mason slowly closed the journal. The mystery had just become much larger and far more personal. Hours passed. Mason spent the afternoon examining the contents of the box. Most of the photographs showed local families from decades earlier. Community picnics, church gatherings, school events, people smiling beneath Montana skies, people who believed they had futures. One photograph caught his attention. Several neighboring ranch families stood together beside a livestock auction. His father appeared among them. So did several faces Mason vaguely remembered from childhood. On the back, someone had written names: the Callahans, the Harpers, the Whitlocks, families his father mentioned repeatedly inside the journal, families that later vanished. The realization deepened his unease. Titan suddenly barked. One sharp bark. Mason looked up. The dog stood near the barn, alert, focused, excited. Mason hurried outside. Titan led him around the structure, past the vegetable garden, toward the rear wall, then stopped. Something lay hidden beneath loose boards, a scrap of cloth. Mason carefully pulled it free. A scarf, small, child-sized, faded blue, yet remarkably preserved. His pulse quickened. This wasn't old. The fabric looked worn through use, not age. Someone still carried it recently. Someone young. The girl. Titan sniffed the scarf repeatedly, then looked toward the forest, the same direction every clue seemed to point. The mountains, the hidden people, the forgotten truth. As evening approached, dark clouds gathered over the western peaks. A storm threatened somewhere beyond the ridges. Mason sat on the porch with the journal resting on his lap. Titan lay beside him. The old shepherd's ears twitched constantly, listening, always listening. Mason opened the journal once more. His eyes returned to the final sentence. Someone survived, but they are too afraid to come home. For the first time, he understood what his father may have been trying to protect. This wasn't simply an abandoned ranch. It wasn't simply a wildfire. Something happened here before the fire. Something nobody wanted remembered. And somehow, 30 years later, Titan had begun uncovering pieces of it. The dog suddenly lifted his head. A low growl emerged from deep within his chest. Mason looked up. Across the valley, near the edge of the forest, stood a figure. Small, still, watching. The girl. For several seconds neither moved. Then she slowly stepped backward, into the shadows, and disappeared. Leaving Mason alone with the journal, the scarf, and the growing certainty that the wildfire had hidden something far darker than anyone in town was willing to admit. Mason sat on the porch long after the girl disappeared into the trees. The blue scarf rested beside his father's journal. Titan lay at his feet, but the old German shepherd never fully relaxed. Every few minutes his ears twitched toward the forest. The dog knew what Mason now suspected. They were getting closer, closer to answers, closer to whoever had been hiding among the mountains all these years. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Sunlight spilled across the valley, illuminating the ranch in shades of gold and green. For the first time since returning, Mason noticed signs of beauty beneath the decay. Wildflowers covered parts of the pasture. Young pine trees had taken root along the creek. The old cottonwood still stood, despite everything it had survived. Life had refused to surrender, much like the mysterious people hiding in the mountains. Mason spent the morning repairing part of the collapsed fence near the northern pasture. The work helped him think. His father's journal replayed constantly in his mind. The missing families, the warnings, the final entry. Someone survived, but they are too afraid to come home. Around noon, the sound of an approaching vehicle echoed through the valley. Mason looked up. Titan immediately stood. The German shepherd's posture changed, alert, suspicious. A black luxury SUV rolled slowly through the broken ranch gate. It looked completely out of place among the ruins. The polished paint reflected the sunlight. Its expensive tires barely touched the dirt road. Mason watched as the vehicle came to a stop near the farmhouse. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out. Tall, well-dressed, confident, probably in his late 50s. Silver hair, expensive boots, the kind of man who had never spent a night wondering where he would sleep. The man smiled, but the smile never reached his eyes. Mason Reed? Mason set down his hammer. Who's asking? The man extended a hand. Garrett Voss. The name immediately sounded familiar. One of the wealthiest land developers in western Montana. Mason had heard it mentioned several times in town. Garrett owned businesses, hotels, timber contracts, real estate projects. Some people admired him. Others clearly didn't. Mason ignored the offered handshake. Garrett withdrew it without embarrassment. His smile remained perfectly intact. I heard you came back. I suppose you did. Garrett looked around the property. His expression carried the polite amusement of someone examining a pile of junk. Quite a place. Mason didn't respond. Garrett continued. I'll get right to the point. Titan moved closer. The dog positioned himself beside Mason, watching, studying, waiting. Garrett noticed the shepherd, a beautiful dog. Titan answered with a low growl. The smile vanished from Garrett's face for the first time, only for a second. Then it returned. I'd like to buy your ranch. The words hung in the air. Mason blinked. Of all the things he expected, that wasn't one of them. Garrett reached into his jacket and removed a folder. Cash offer. Mason didn't take it. Garrett opened the folder anyway. The number printed inside was far larger than Mason expected. Far more than the ruined property should have been worth. His suspicion immediately grew. Why? Garrett shrugged casually. Business. Business? The county's expanding. Development opportunities. Future investments. Mason stared at him. The explanation felt rehearsed. Weak. False. The ranch sat miles from anywhere. Most people considered it worthless. Yet Garrett looked eager, almost desperate. Mason slowly folded his arms. I'm not selling. Garrett's smile tightened. You haven't even heard the full offer. I'm not selling. For several moments, neither man spoke. The wind moved through the grass. Titan never stopped watching Garrett. The developer finally sighed. Maybe you're being sentimental. Maybe. This place is falling apart. I noticed. You'll spend the rest of your life fixing it. Mason nodded. Probably. Garrett's eyes narrowed slightly. The charm began slipping. Just a little. Then his gaze drifted toward the barn. The garden hidden behind it. The forest beyond. Something flashed across his face. Concern. Only for a moment. But Mason saw it. Years of military service had taught him how to read people. Garrett wasn't looking at the ranch. He was looking for something. Or someone. The realization sent a warning through Mason's mind. Garrett spoke again. Tell me something. What? Have you found anything unusual out here? Mason remained silent. Garrett continued. Any people? The question came too quickly. Too directly. Titan growled again. This time louder. Garrett glanced down at the dog. The discomfort in his eyes became impossible to miss. Mason felt the pieces beginning to shift. Why would you ask that? Garrett forced a laugh. Just curious. About what? The old stories? What stories? Garrett waved a hand dismissively. Nothing important. The conversation had changed. Now both men knew it. Mason took a step forward. What do you know about the families who disappeared before the wildfire? The reaction was immediate. Garrett froze. Not for long, less than a second. But it happened. Enough. His smile disappeared completely. The air between them seemed colder. I don't know what you're talking about. Mason held his gaze. Interesting. Garrett's jaw tightened. Titan moved even closer. The shepherd stood directly between the two men now. Protective. Unwavering. Garrett finally stepped backward. I'll leave the offer. I'm not interested. You should think about it. No. For the first time, genuine irritation appeared on Garrett's face. The mask slipped. Only briefly. Then it was gone. He returned to the SUV. Before entering, he looked back toward the ranch, toward the mountains, toward the forest. The expression in his eyes disturbed Mason. Not greed, not business, fear. Then Garrett climbed into the vehicle and drove away. The SUV disappeared down the dirt road. Silence returned. Mason watched until the dust settled. Titan remained standing, still staring after the departing vehicle. Something's wrong with him, isn't it? Titan gave a short bark. Mason smiled despite himself. Yeah, I think so too. That evening, Mason drove into Elk Ridge for supplies. The atmosphere felt different. People watched him, whispered. Conversations stopped when he entered buildings. At the hardware store, a man he barely remembered approached him. You should sell. Mason frowned. What? The ranch. Several nearby customers glanced over. The man shifted uncomfortably. People are saying you're causing trouble. Mason stared. What kind of trouble? The man didn't answer. He simply walked away. The same thing happened twice more before Mason left town. Someone had been talking. Someone powerful. Someone who wanted him gone. As the sun began setting behind the mountains, Mason drove back toward the ranch. The road wound through forests glowing orange beneath the evening light. Titan sat quietly beside him, watching the trees, watching the shadows. When the ranch finally came into view, Mason felt the familiar pull in his chest. Home. Broken. Scarred. But home. Then Titan suddenly growled. Low. Dangerous. Mason followed the dog's gaze. At the edge of the forest stood the girl, watching the ranch, watching him, watching Titan. This time she didn't run immediately. For several seconds she remained perfectly still. Then her eyes shifted toward the road Garrett had used. Fear appeared on her face. Real fear. Not fear of Mason. Not fear of Titan. Fear of Garrett Voss. A second later, she disappeared into the trees, and in that moment, Mason understood one thing with absolute certainty. The wealthy developer wasn't interested in the land. He was interested in whatever or whoever was hidden beyond the mountains. And the closer Mason got to the truth, the harder Garrett Voss was going to push back. For 3 days, the ranch settled into an uneasy rhythm. By daylight, Mason repaired fences, cleared debris, and studied his father's journal. By night, he watched the tree line, and so did Titan. The girl continued appearing from time to time, never close, never long, a glimpse near the forest, a shadow beside the creek, a figure standing briefly on a distant ridge before vanishing again. Each sighting confirmed the same thing. Someone was watching them. Someone wanted to be seen just enough to prove they existed, but not enough to be found. Titan became increasingly restless. The old shepherd spent hours following scent trails around the property. He investigated areas Mason couldn't understand, certain trees, certain rocks, sections of the forest where nothing appeared unusual. Yet every time, Titan returned smelling of pine needles and mountain earth, carrying that same determined expression. The dog was hunting a puzzle, and Mason had learned long ago not to interrupt Titan when he worked. One evening, dark clouds gathered above the Bitterroot Mountains. The sky turned the color of steel. Wind swept across the valley. The horses near the barn grew uneasy. Birds vanished into shelter. A storm was coming. A powerful one. Mason finished securing loose boards around the farmhouse before darkness arrived. Thunder rumbled far away. Titan stood near the edge of the yard, watching the mountains, watching the forest. The dog seemed unusually focused, almost tense. Mason stepped onto the porch. "Come on, partner." Titan glanced back. For a moment, Mason thought the shepherd would obey. Instead, Titan looked toward the forest again. Then something happened. The dog bolted, straight into the trees, fast, purposeful, gone. Mason blinked. Titan! The German shepherd never hesitated. Within seconds, darkness swallowed him. Mason hurried across the yard. Titan! No response. Only wind. Only distant thunder. His pulse quickened. Titan had wandered before, but never like this. Never during a storm. Never without checking back. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. The first raindrops began falling. Large, cold, heavy. Mason grabbed his flashlight and rain jacket, then headed into the forest. The trail disappeared almost immediately. Rain hammered the trees. Branches swayed violently overhead. Thunder echoed through the mountains. Titan. Nothing. Mason pushed deeper into the woods. His flashlight beam danced between trunks and shadows. The forest seemed alive. Every gust of wind sounded like movement. Every shifting branch looked like a figure. The storm intensified. Lightning flashed across the sky. For a split second, the entire mountainside glowed white. Then darkness returned. Mason's chest tightened, not from exhaustion, from memory. The storm, the darkness, the uncertainty. The feeling dragged him backward through time, back to combat, back to patrols in hostile terrain, back to nights when friends disappeared into darkness and never returned. He stopped walking. His breathing became uneven. The forest around him seemed to shift. Suddenly, he wasn't in Montana anymore. He was overseas. Gunfire echoed through his memory. Voices shouted. Explosions rattled the ground. His heartbeat accelerated. His vision narrowed. The familiar grip of PTSD wrapped around him. For a terrifying moment, he lost track of where he was, lost track of what was real. Then another flash of lightning illuminated the forest. Reality returned. Montana. The ranch. Titan. The dog was missing. Mason forced himself forward. One step, then another. The rain soaked him completely. Hours passed. The mountains grew darker, colder, more dangerous. Still no sign of Titan. The possibility Mason refused to consider began creeping into his thoughts. The dog was old, far older than most working dogs. Injuries accumulated over years. Age weakened even the strongest companions. What if something happened? What if Titan needed help? The thought struck harder than any fear he'd faced in years. Because Titan wasn't just a dog. Titan was family, the last family he had. The storm reached its peak shortly after midnight. Lightning cracked across the sky. Rain transformed trails into rivers of mud. Mason slipped several times climbing steep terrain, yet he continued. Calling, searching, praying. Finally, near dawn, he found something. A track. Fresh. Large. Canine. Titan. Relief surged through him. Then he saw the blood. Only a few drops, scattered across a patch of wet stone. His heart stopped. The red stains seemed impossibly bright against the gray rock. Mason knelt immediately. His hands trembled. No, no, no. The blood trail continued uphill. Not much, but enough. Fear settled heavily inside him. He followed. The storm slowly weakened as dawn approached. Clouds drifted between the peaks. Mist clung to the mountainsides. Everything felt silent. Then he heard it. A bark. Faint. Distant. Titan. Mason ran, ignoring the pain in his knees, ignoring exhaustion, ignoring everything. Another bark echoed through the forest. Closer. He rounded a cluster of boulders and froze. Titan stood there, mud-covered, exhausted, one side of his shoulder stained with blood. But alive. Very much alive. Relief hit Mason so hard he nearly collapsed. Titan. The shepherd limped toward him, tail wagging weakly. Mason dropped to one knee. His hands moved across the dog's body, checking injuries. The wound appeared superficial, a deep scrape rather than a serious bite or puncture. Painful, but survivable. What happened to you? Titan didn't answer, of course. Instead, the dog gently dropped something at Mason's feet. A leather pouch, old, weathered, tied shut with a thin cord. Mason stared. The pouch clearly hadn't come from the forest. Someone owned it. Someone had hidden it, or lost it. Titan sat beside it proudly, as though presenting evidence. Mason slowly untied the cord. Inside were photographs, several dozen. Old photographs, black and white. A few color images faded with age. Mason carefully examined them. His pulse quickened. Families, children, ranches, people standing beside homes, people smiling at picnics, people gathered for community events. Then he recognized one of the faces, from his father's journal, from the photograph hidden in the metal box. The Callahans, the missing family. His breath caught. The photographs belonged to them. Some showed children. Others showed a young woman he had never seen before. One image revealed a ranch house that no longer existed. Another showed several community members standing beside a livestock truck. Written on the back was a date. 31 years ago. Before the wildfire. Before the disappearances. Before everything changed. Mason looked at Titan. The old shepherd watched him carefully, waiting. The realization struck like lightning. Titan hadn't wandered off. He hadn't gotten lost. He had followed a trail connected to the missing families, connected to the people hiding in the mountains, connected to the truth. The dog had spent the entire night doing exactly what he'd been trying to do since arriving, finding answers. Mason carefully returned the photographs to the pouch, then looked toward the mountains. Somewhere beyond those ridges, someone knew where these photographs came from. Someone knew why they mattered. And judging by the age of the pouch, someone had protected them for decades. The storm clouds slowly drifted away. Morning sunlight began breaking through. Golden rays illuminated the valley below. For the first time since returning to the ranch, Mason felt certain of one thing. They weren't chasing a ghost story. They were chasing real people, real survivors, and Titan had just uncovered the first piece of proof. As Mason and the old shepherd began the long walk home, neither noticed a figure watching from a distant ridge. A girl stood among the trees, silent, motionless, watching them recover the photographs, watching Titan, watching Mason. Then she disappeared back into the mountains. And somewhere beyond the peaks, hidden secrets stirred once again. For the next 2 days, Mason barely left the ranch. The photographs Titan had recovered occupied nearly every waking thought. He spread them across the old kitchen table he had salvaged from the farmhouse ruins. Each image revealed another fragment of a forgotten world. Families smiling beside livestock, children fishing along mountain streams, community picnics, harvest celebrations, ordinary lives, lives that had vanished. The names from his father's journal appeared again and again. Callahan, Whitlock, Harper, families that supposedly disappeared before the wildfire, families nobody seemed willing to discuss. Titan spent most of those days recovering from his injury. The scrape along his shoulder was healing well, yet the old shepherd remained restless. Every morning he stood facing the mountains. Every evening he patrolled the tree line. The dog seemed to know the journey wasn't over. He had found the trail. Now he wanted to follow it to the end. Late on the third afternoon, Mason noticed something unusual. A small bundle rested beside the porch. It hadn't been there that morning. Titan discovered it first. The shepherd approached carefully, sniffed, then looked toward the forest. The bundle contained food, fresh bread, 2 apples, a small jar of preserves, and beneath everything rested a folded piece of paper. No words, only a simple drawing, a narrow canyon between 2 mountain ridges, and a small X marked deep within. Mason stared at it. His pulse quickened. The girl. It had to be. Someone had finally reached out. Not with words, with directions. Titan immediately became excited. The dog's tail wagged. His ears rose. His entire posture changed. Mason couldn't remember the last time he'd seen the old shepherd so energized. "You know where this is, don't you?" Titan barked once. The answer seemed obvious. The following morning they left before sunrise. Mist covered the valley floor. The mountains loomed above them like ancient guardians. Mason packed water, food, medical supplies, and the photographs Titan had recovered. Then he and the shepherd headed into the wilderness. The route wasn't easy. The canyon marked on the drawing lay far beyond the ranch boundaries. Steep slopes forced them higher into the mountains. Several times Mason had to stop and catch his breath. Age reminded him of its presence more often these days. Titan, despite his injury, remained determined. The shepherd moved ahead constantly, checking trails, investigating scents, pausing only long enough to ensure Mason followed. Hours passed. The terrain became rougher, more isolated. The signs of civilization disappeared completely. No roads, no fences, no power lines, only mountains, forest, and silence. By midday, they reached the canyon. Mason immediately understood why nobody had discovered it. The entrance remained hidden between towering cliffs covered in pine trees. From a distance, it appeared to be nothing more than solid rock. Only up close did the narrow passage reveal itself. Titan entered without hesitation. The canyon stretched deep into the mountain. Cool air drifted through the passage. Water trickled somewhere unseen. The walls rose hundreds of feet overhead. The place felt untouched by time. Then Mason saw smoke, thin, gray, rising beyond a bend in the canyon. His heartbeat accelerated. Someone lived here. Titan moved forward, not cautiously, confidently, as though following a familiar scent. The canyon widened suddenly, and Mason stopped. A cabin stood before them, hidden in the heart of the mountains. Small, weathered, carefully maintained. A vegetable garden grew beside it. Several goats grazed nearby. A horse stood beneath the shelter. Everything looked clean, orderly, loved. This wasn't a temporary refuge. Someone had built a life here. Titan barked. A door opened. An elderly woman stepped outside. She moved slowly, but carried herself with surprising strength. Long silver hair framed a face marked by hardship and time. Behind her appeared the girl, the same girl Mason had been chasing through the forest for weeks. She immediately recognized Titan. A smile crossed her face, the first Mason had seen. The shepherd trotted toward her. The girl knelt, wrapped her arms around the dog's neck. Titan leaned against her happily. The sight told Mason everything. They knew each other, had known each other for some time. The elderly woman watched quietly, studying Mason, evaluating him. Much the way soldiers evaluate strangers before deciding whether they can be trusted. Finally, she spoke. "You must be Mason Reed." Her voice carried the weight of decades. Mason nodded. "And you're the one who's been living on my ranch?" The woman glanced toward the mountains. "No." She smiled sadly. "We've been protecting it," and silence followed. The statement felt important. The girl stood. She looked no older than 16. Her eyes remained cautious but no longer fearful. "I'm Emma." Mason nodded. "Mason." The elderly woman extended a weathered hand. "Ruth Callahan." The name hit him immediately. Callahan. One of the names from the journal. One of the missing families. For several moments, nobody spoke. The wind moved gently through the canyon. Birds called from nearby trees. The entire world seemed to pause. Then Mason slowly reached into his pack. He removed one of the photographs, a family portrait, the Callahans. Ruth stared at it, Her eyes widened, emotion flooded her face. For a moment, she looked decades younger. "Where did you find that?" Mason handed her the photograph. Titan found a pouch. Ruth carefully touched the image. Her hands trembled. Emma moved beside her grandmother. Together they stared at the faces frozen in time. Lost family members. Lost lives. Lost memories. Many seconds passed before Ruth spoke again. "We thought those were gone forever." Titan sat quietly beside them. The old shepherd looked almost satisfied, as if his mission was finally making sense. Ruth eventually looked at Mason. Her eyes glistened. "Come inside." The cabin felt warm, safe, alive. Family photographs covered the walls. Handmade furniture filled the rooms. The smell of fresh bread lingered in the air. Everything about the place felt different from the outside world, like a hidden sanctuary. Over cups of coffee, the story slowly emerged. Not the entire story, only enough to begin. Ruth's family had once lived near Mason's ranch, before the wildfire, before everything changed. After the disaster, they never returned. Instead, they disappeared. The official story claimed they moved away. The truth was far more complicated. "We stayed hidden," Ruth admitted quietly, "for 30 years. Mason looked at Emma. The teenager lowered her eyes. "You've lived here your whole life?" Emma nodded. "Mostly." Mason struggled to imagine it. An entire life spent hidden among the mountains, away from towns, away from schools, away from the world. Ruth noticed his expression. "We did what we had to do." Something dark lingered beneath those words, something painful, something she wasn't ready to reveal. Not yet. Mason understood. Years in the military taught him patience. Some wounds required trust before they could be opened. The afternoon passed quickly. Titan spent most of it beside Emma. The shepherd clearly trusted her. Perhaps he always had. Mason noticed something else. The animals from the ranch, the horses, the goats, the chickens, they all bore familiar markings. They weren't random strays. They belonged here, or had once belonged to families connected to this place. The realization struck him. Ruth saw it in his eyes. "We've been caring for them for years." Mason nodded. "The ranch." Ruth smiled softly. "The animals always return there." The statement carried a deeper meaning. As sunset approached, golden light filled the canyon. The mountains glowed with fire-colored brilliance. For the first time in decades, Mason felt closer to the truth than ever before. The missing family was real. They had survived. They had protected the ranch. And somehow, Titan had led him directly to them. Yet as Mason prepared to leave for the evening, he noticed something troubling. When he mentioned Garrett Voss, Ruth's face changed. The warmth vanished instantly. Fear appeared. Real fear. The same fear he had seen in Emma's eyes. The same fear he had seen when the girl spotted Garrett's vehicle. Ruth looked toward the cabin windows, toward the mountains beyond. Then she whispered 4 words. "We were hoping he wouldn't find us." And in that moment, Mason realized the mystery wasn't ending. It was only beginning. The words lingered in the cabin long after Ruth spoke them. "We were hoping he wouldn't find us." Outside, the sun continued its slow descent behind the mountains. Golden light stretched across the canyon, casting long shadows over the hidden sanctuary. Inside, silence settled over the room. Emma stared into her coffee. Titan rested beside her chair. The old German shepherd seemed unusually calm, as though he understood something important was finally about to be revealed. Mason leaned forward. What exactly are you hiding from? Ruth didn't answer immediately. Her weathered hands tightened around the cup. The years seemed to settle heavily upon her shoulders. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded smaller than before. Telling the truth cost people everything. The statement hung in the air. Mason waited. He had learned long ago that some stories couldn't be rushed, especially painful ones. Ruth stood and crossed the cabin. From a wooden chest near the fireplace, she removed a small metal box. Unlike the one Mason had found beneath the farmhouse floor, this one showed signs of being opened many times. Protected, preserved, important. She placed it carefully on the table. Emma lowered her eyes. The girl clearly knew what was inside. Perhaps she had seen it many times before. Perhaps this was the burden her family had carried for decades. Ruth opened the box. Inside lay dozens of documents, letters, photographs, maps, newspaper clippings, folders tied together with string. Mason immediately recognized the careful organization. Someone had spent years protecting this evidence, years waiting for the right moment. The old woman removed a faded photograph first. She handed it to Mason. The image showed several men standing beside logging equipment. Most appeared ordinary enough. Ranchers, workers, businessmen. One face stood out. A younger version of Garrett Voss's father. Mason recognized him immediately. William Voss. A powerful businessman who had dominated the region decades earlier. The father of the man currently trying to buy the ranch. Ruth pointed toward the photograph. Everything started with him. The room seemed to grow colder. Outside, the wind moved through the canyon. Titan lifted his head, listening, watching, always watching. Mason studied the photograph. What did he do? Ruth looked toward the window, toward the mountains, toward memories she had clearly spent years trying to escape. He wanted the valley. Mason frowned. The whole valley. She nodded. The ranches, the timber rights, the streams, the land. Her voice hardened. The problem was that people lived there. Emma quietly placed another photograph on the table. This one showed dozens of families gathered during a community event. Children laughing, neighbors talking, ordinary people. The kind of people powerful men often overlook. They wouldn't sell, Ruth said. Most families had been there for generations. Mason immediately thought of his father. Stubborn, proud. The kind of man who would never abandon land willingly. Ruth continued. Offers came first. She pulled several documents from the box. Purchase contracts, land agreements, letters. Many were signed, many weren't. The people who refused began having problems. Mason felt his pulse quicken. What kind of problems? Equipment disappeared. Livestock died. Threats. The room fell silent again. Mason understood exactly where this story was heading, and he didn't like it. Ruth removed another folder. Inside were copies of handwritten statements, witness accounts, notes, reports, things that should have been investigated, things that apparently weren't. Then she revealed the piece that changed everything. A map. The map showed the entire valley before the wildfire. Several locations had been marked with red circles. Ranches, barns, storage sites, areas connected by old service roads. Mason leaned closer. His stomach tightened. Every red circle surrounded land owned by families who later disappeared, including the Callahans, including his own family. What is this? Ruth closed her eyes. For a moment she seemed exhausted, as if carrying the truth for 30 years had finally become too heavy. Then she opened them again. The fire wasn't an accident. The words struck like thunder. Mason stared, unable to speak, unable to move. For 30 years, the wildfire had existed in his memory as a natural disaster. Terrible, tragic, but natural. Now everything shifted. Everything. Ruth continued. Several people discovered what was happening. Her voice trembled. They discovered land was being cleared through fear. Mason's jaw tightened. And then? They tried to stop it. Another photograph appeared. This one showed several men gathered around a pickup truck. One face immediately caught Mason's attention. His father, much younger, standing beside other local ranchers. Ruth pointed. They started collecting evidence. Mason's throat tightened. My father knew? He knew enough to be worried. The realization hit harder than expected. His father hadn't simply been a victim of tragedy. He had been investigating something, fighting something, protecting something. Ruth carefully unfolded one final document, a witness statement. The paper had aged considerably, but the signature remained visible. A former employee of William Voss. The man claimed that controlled fires had been discussed during private meetings, not to destroy entire towns, not officially, just enough to pressure people, enough to create fear, enough to force families off land. Then everything went wrong. The fire escaped control, fueled by wind, fueled by drought, fueled by greed. The wildfire consumed thousands of acres, destroyed homes, killed livestock, shattered lives, and buried the truth beneath chaos. Mason stared at the document. His hands trembled slightly. Memories returned. The flames, the screaming, the evacuation, his mother's tears, his father's silence afterward. 30 years of pain suddenly looked different. Not random, not meaningless. Created. Titan moved closer. The shepherd rested his head against Mason's leg, grounding him, steadying him. The old dog always seemed to know when the darkness grew too heavy. Mason lowered a hand onto Titan's neck. The simple gesture helped. Ruth wasn't finished. There were witnesses. Her voice softened. People who survived. Mason looked up. Your family. She nodded. My husband discovered too much. The room became painfully quiet. Emma stared at the floor. Tears glistened in her eyes. We were warned. Ruth's gaze drifted toward the mountains. After the fire, we realized some people wanted the evidence gone. Mason understood. The disappearances, the secrecy, the cabin. Everything suddenly made sense. You hid. We survived. For 30 years. 30 years living in isolation. 30 years protecting documents. 30 years waiting. Emma finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. We thought nobody would ever believe us. Mason looked at Titan, then at the evidence covering the table, then at Ruth. They will now. The old woman smiled sadly. I used to believe that. The sun finally disappeared behind the mountains. Darkness settled over the canyon. Inside the cabin, lantern light flickered softly against the walls. The evidence remained spread across the table. A lifetime of secrets. A lifetime of fear. A lifetime of truth. Then Mason noticed something else. One of the folders had been opened recently. Very recently. Ruth followed his gaze. Her expression darkened. He knows. Mason felt a chill. Garrett? She nodded. He doesn't know everything. But he knows we're still alive. The realization hit immediately. Garrett wasn't trying to buy the ranch because of development. He wasn't interested in profit. He was searching for the people who escaped. searching for the evidence, searching for the truth his father buried decades ago. Outside, somewhere beyond the canyon walls, thunder rumbled faintly across the mountains. A storm was approaching, and for the first time since returning home, Mason understood the real danger. The wildfire had destroyed his childhood, but the people responsible were still casting shadows over the valley. And now, because of Titan's discoveries, those shadows were beginning to move once again. The storm arrived 2 days later. It rolled across the Bitterroot Mountains like a living wall. Dark clouds swallowed the sky. Thunder echoed through the valleys. The wind bent pine trees and swept across the ranch in powerful gusts. Mason stood on the porch of the farmhouse, watching the approaching weather. Titan sat beside him. The old German shepherd's ears remained fixed toward the mountains, toward the hidden canyon, toward Ruth and Emma. Since discovering the truth, Mason had made several trips to the cabin. Together they had begun organizing the evidence. Photographs, witness statements, maps, letters, every document connected another piece of the story, and every document increased the danger. Garrett Voss was no longer guessing. He was searching. The pressure had become obvious. Strange vehicles appeared near the ranch road. Unknown men asked questions in town. Several neighbors quietly warned Mason that people were watching his property. The closer they came to exposing the truth, the more nervous Garrett seemed to become. Titan suddenly stood. A low growl vibrated deep in his chest. Mason followed the dog's gaze. A truck, far down the dirt road, moving slowly, too slowly, watching. The vehicle eventually turned around and disappeared. But the message was clear. They weren't alone. That afternoon, Mason saddled one of the horses Ruth had helped rehabilitate. The sky had already darkened considerably. Rain threatened in the distance. Titan jumped into the truck beside him. They headed toward the canyon. Something felt wrong. The feeling grew stronger with every mile. Years of military experience had taught Mason to trust instincts. And right now, every instinct told him trouble was coming. When they reached the hidden canyon, Titan leaped from the truck before it stopped. The shepherd sprinted toward the cabin, barking, urgently, not excited, alarmed. Mason immediately followed. The cabin door opened. Emma appeared first. Fear filled her face. Behind her, Ruth stepped onto the porch. "Mason." Her voice trembled. "What happened?" Ruth held up a piece of paper. A note. No signature. Only a message. "We know where you are." The words seemed colder than the storm itself. Thunder rolled across the mountains. Titan barked again. The old shepherd moved restlessly around the cabin, checking the perimeter, watching the tree line, working. Mason examined the surrounding area. Fresh tire tracks, recent footprints. Someone had been there. Very recently. The threat was no longer hidden. Garrett's people had found them. The question was what came next. The answer arrived shortly after sunset. Lightning flashed across the sky. Rain hammered the canyon. Wind screamed between the cliffs. The storm had reached full strength. Inside the cabin, Mason reviewed emergency plans with Ruth and Emma. If anything happened, they would evacuate through an old trail leading deeper into the mountains. The evidence had already been packed into waterproof containers. Everything important stood ready. Titan suddenly froze. The dog's head snapped toward the door. His body stiffened. A second later, he barked. Loud, sharp, warning. Mason grabbed a flashlight. Then another sound reached them. An engine, several engines, outside, moving through the storm. The cabin went silent. Emma looked terrified. Ruth's face turned pale. Mason moved to the window. Headlights appeared beyond the trees. Multiple vehicles. Too many. His stomach tightened. They had come. Titan growled fiercely. The old shepherd moved from window to window, tracking movement, calculating, protecting. The vehicles stopped. Doors opened. Figures emerged into the rain. Several men. Flashlights. Moving deliberately. Searching. The storm concealed much of their approach, but not enough. Mason immediately shifted into the mindset he hadn't used in years. The SEAL, calm, focused, methodical. He wasn't interested in fighting. He was interested in survival. Emma. The teenager looked up. Take the evidence. She nodded. Ruth, stay with her. What about you? I'm getting everyone out. Titan barked once, almost as if volunteering. Mason placed a hand on the shepherd's neck. Stay close. Outside, lightning illuminated the canyon. For a brief second, the entire landscape glowed white. The men were closer now, much closer. One carried something in his hands. A fuel can. Mason's blood ran cold. Not again. Not another fire. Not after 30 years. Not after everything. The realization struck with brutal clarity. They intended to destroy the cabin. Destroy the evidence. Destroy the truth. Just as others had tried decades earlier. Thunder exploded overhead. Rain poured from the sky. Yet the threat remained. Fire didn't need much to begin. Mason led Ruth and Emma through the rear exit. The narrow trail disappeared into darkness. Titan moved beside them, guiding, protecting, watching every direction at once. Then chaos erupted. A crash echoed from the front of the cabin. Shouts, breaking wood. The intruders had entered. Mason immediately changed direction. Keep moving. Emma hesitated. What about you? I'll catch up. The teenager looked ready to argue. Titan suddenly nudged her forward. The shepherd understood. Protect the family. Mason turned back toward the cabin. Rain soaked him instantly. The storm raged around him. Lightning flashed again. For a moment he saw shadows moving through the trees, searching, spreading out, trying to locate the escape route. Then a scream shattered the darkness. Emma. Mason spun around. One of the intruders had circled ahead. The man emerged near the trail, blocking their path. Emma stumbled backward. Ruth grabbed her arm. Titan reacted instantly. The old shepherd launched himself forward. Despite his age, despite his injuries, despite everything, he moved with astonishing speed. The dog placed himself directly between Emma and danger, barking, snarling, holding the man's attention. The intruder stumbled backward in surprise. Titan kept advancing, protecting, buying time, exactly as he had done his entire life. Mason reached them seconds later. The confrontation ended almost immediately as the man retreated into the storm. But the cost had already been paid. Titan limped, badly. The shepherd's front leg shook beneath him. Mason dropped beside him. Titan. The dog remained standing, determined, refusing to quit. Yet pain showed clearly. Emma knelt beside him, tears mixed with rain. Titan licked her hand, then looked back toward the trail, still focused on the mission, still protecting. Mason felt something tighten inside his chest. The old shepherd had sacrificed himself without hesitation. Again. Just as he always had. Another lightning strike illuminated the canyon. The cabin stood behind them, partially damaged. Rain pouring across the roof. The evidence remained safe. Ruth and Emma remained safe. But the night was far from over. The storm continued. The intruders were still somewhere in the darkness. And as Mason helped Titan back onto the trail, one realization became impossible to ignore. This was no longer a mystery, no longer an investigation. It had become a battle between truth and fear. And before dawn arrived, someone would finally have to lose. Rain pounded the mountains through the darkest hours of the night. The hidden canyon seemed trapped beneath a world of thunder and shadows. Water rushed down rocky slopes, branches bent beneath powerful winds. Lightning flashed again and again, turning the wilderness into brief frozen images of silver and black. Mason stayed close to Titan. The old German shepherd limped beside him as they followed Ruth and Emma deeper into the mountains. The evidence remained secure inside waterproof containers strapped to a pack horse. Every photograph, every witness statement, every document. 30 years of truth survived the attack. But Mason barely thought about the evidence anymore. His attention remained fixed on Titan. The shepherd's injury looked worse, much worse. The dog continued moving, continued protecting, continued watching their surroundings. Yet every step required more effort. Every step seemed heavier than the last. Emma noticed it too. The teenager walked beside Titan, occasionally resting a hand on his shoulder, whispering encouragement. The old dog responded with small movements of his tail. He was tired, exhausted, but still determined. The group finally reached an abandoned ranger station hidden high in the mountains. The structure had not been used for years, yet it offered shelter. A roof, walls, protection from the storm. Inside, lantern light flickered across rough wooden beams. The air smelled of old timber and rain-soaked earth. For the first time all night, they stopped moving. Mason immediately examined Titan's injury. The shepherd lay quietly on a blanket. Something about that frightened Mason. Titan was never quiet when injured. He usually resisted treatment, usually tried to stand, usually refused weakness. Now he simply rested. And that scared Mason more than any storm. Ruth helped clean the wound. Emma held a flashlight. The injury itself wasn't catastrophic. Yet the problem wasn't only the injury. It was Titan's age, the years, the miles, the countless sacrifices. The old dog had spent a lifetime protecting others. Even heroes eventually carried the cost. Titan lifted his head slightly. His eyes met Mason's. The look hit harder than any words ever could. Trust, loyalty, faith. Everything that had defined their partnership. Mason swallowed hard. You stay with me. Titan blinked slowly. Outside, the storm continued raging. Hours passed. No one slept. Shortly after midnight, headlights appeared far below in the valley. Several vehicles. Then more. Mason moved toward a window. His pulse quickened. The lights weren't searching anymore. They were gathering. Something had changed. A satellite phone rested on the table nearby. Earlier that evening, before leaving the canyon, Ruth had finally made a call. Not to local officials, not to anyone connected to Elk Ridge, to investigators from outside the county. People who couldn't be influenced by local relationships. People willing to review the evidence. People willing to listen. Perhaps help was finally coming. Or perhaps it was already too late. The uncertainty hung heavily over everyone. Near 2 o'clock in the morning, another call arrived. Ruth answered. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. When she hung up, tears filled her eyes. Mason immediately stood. What happened? Ruth looked at him. For the first time since they'd met, genuine hope appeared in her expression. They have the evidence. Silence filled the room. Then Emma gasped softly. Ruth continued. The copies were received. Every document had already been transmitted, stored, protected. Impossible to destroy now. 30 years of secrets no longer depended upon a single box hidden in the mountains. The truth had escaped. Mason felt relief wash through him. the first real relief in weeks. Titan slowly opened his eyes, almost as if he understood. Emma knelt beside him. "We did it." The shepherd's tail moved weakly against the floor. Outside, the storm finally began weakening. The thunder moved farther away. The rain softened. Dawn remained several hours away. Yet something had changed. The darkness no longer felt endless. The longest night was beginning to break. Then Titan collapsed. One moment he was resting. The next his head dropped heavily onto the blanket. Emma froze. Ruth immediately moved forward. Mason's heart stopped. "Titan." No response. The shepherd's breathing had become shallow, uneven. The room instantly transformed. The investigation, the evidence. Garrett Voss. None of it mattered anymore. Nothing mattered except Titan. Mason dropped beside him. The old soldier's hands trembled. He hated that. Hated feeling helpless. Hated being unable to fix what mattered most. Titan had carried him through war, through homelessness, through PTSD, through years when nobody else remained. The thought of losing him felt unbearable. For hours, Mason remained beside the dog, never leaving, never sleeping. Sometimes he spoke quietly, sharing memories, stories, moments only the two of them understood. Other times he simply sat in silence, holding Titan's paw, waiting, praying. Outside, dawn finally arrived. Gray light spilled across the mountains. The storm had passed. The world looked washed clean, peaceful, beautiful. Then another vehicle approached the ranger station. This time nobody panicked. The visitors weren't Garrett's men. Several investigators stepped out, along with state law enforcement officers. They carried folders, documents, evidence. Everything Ruth had protected. Everything Titan had uncovered. The truth was finally moving into daylight. Hours later, confirmation arrived. Garrett Voss had been arrested. Not because of a single accusation, not because of rumors, because the evidence established a chain connecting decades of concealment, intimidation, and the suppression of critical information tied to the original disaster. The investigation would continue. Many questions remained. But the wall of silence had cracked. The valley would finally learn what happened. Emma cried. Ruth embraced her. The burden she'd carried for 30 years had finally begun lifting. Yet Mason barely reacted. The news felt distant, muted, because Titan still hadn't opened his eyes. The old shepherd remained motionless on the blanket, breathing, but weak. Very weak. As the morning stretched onward, people celebrated. Phone calls were made. Statements were taken. Plans were discussed. Life moved forward. But Mason stayed exactly where he was, beside Titan, the dog who never left him, the dog who followed a scent trail into the mountains, the dog who found the missing family, the dog who uncovered the truth, the dog who saved Emma, the dog who brought him home. By afternoon, sunlight filled the ranger station. Warm beams crossed the wooden floor. Dust drifted through the air. The mountains stood silent beyond the windows. Mason sat alone beside Titan. Exhaustion weighed heavily upon him. Then he felt movement. Small, barely noticeable. A twitch beneath his hand. His head snapped downward. Titan's ear moved. Then again. Hope surged through him so suddenly it almost hurt. Titan? The shepherd remained still, but the movement had been real. Very real. Mason leaned closer. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to believe. Maybe the story wasn't over. Maybe the hardest battle hadn't been the fight for truth. Maybe it was this moment, this fragile space between loss and hope. And as the sunlight continued filling the room, Mason realized something unexpected. The outcome of the investigation no longer frightened him. Garrett's future would be decided. The evidence would speak. The truth would survive. But none of that mattered as much as one simple question. Would Titan survive long enough to come home? The answer did not come that day, or the next. For nearly a week, Mason remained at the small veterinary clinic in Hamilton, Montana. The investigators continued their work. Reporters arrived in Elk Ridge. State officials reviewed decades of records. The story spread far beyond the valley. But Mason cared about only one room, one patient, one companion. Titan. The old German shepherd slept more than he woke. His breathing slowly strengthened. His injuries gradually healed. Yet every morning Mason arrived fearing the same thing, that he might be too late. The fear surprised him. He had faced combat, loss, homelessness, the death of friends, the collapse of dreams, yet nothing felt as terrifying as sitting beside Titan's bed and waiting. Waiting for movement, waiting for hope, waiting for a sign. On the seventh morning, sunlight streamed through the clinic window. Golden rays illuminated the floor. Outside, summer had fully arrived. The mountains stood bright and green beyond town. Mason sat beside Titan as usual. A cup of cold coffee rested untouched nearby. The shepherd appeared asleep. Quiet. Still. Then a familiar sound reached him. A sigh. Mason looked up. Titan's eyes were open. Not halfway. Not briefly. Fully open, watching him. For several seconds, neither moved, neither needed to. The moment said everything. Mason laughed, then unexpectedly felt tears in his eyes. Took you long enough. Titan's tail thumped weakly against the blanket. Once, then again. The veterinarian entered moments later. Her smile appeared immediately. Looks like somebody decided he's not done with us yet. Mason reached down and scratched behind Titan's ears. The old shepherd leaned into the touch, just as he always had. Just as he had after missions overseas. Just as he had after nightmares. Just as he had after every difficult chapter of their Lefsion. The road home began shortly afterward. Slowly, carefully, 1 mile at a time. When Mason finally drove back toward the ranch, Titan rested comfortably in the passenger seat. The same seat he had occupied for years. The same seat where countless journeys had begun. The mountains welcomed them home beneath clear blue skies. The valley looked different now, not because the land had changed, because Mason had. The ranch no longer felt haunted. It no longer felt abandoned. It no longer felt trapped beneath the shadow of the wildfire. Life filled it once more. When the truck reached the property, people were waiting. More than Mason expected. Neighbors, volunteers, families, even some of the same townspeople who had laughed at him weeks earlier. Children ran toward the fence. Several horses grazed peacefully near the barn. The repaired farmhouse stood stronger than before. Not perfect, but alive. Very much alive. Titan slowly climbed from the truck. The old shepherd moved carefully. His body still carried scars from the recent ordeal. Yet the moment his paws touched the ground, something changed. His ears lifted. His eyes brightened. The ranch. Home. Emma came running first. The teenager dropped to her knees and hugged him gently. Titan's tail wagged immediately. Nearby, Ruth stood smiling. Healthier than Mason had ever seen her. Lighter, freer. The burden she'd carried for 30 years was finally gone. The investigation had continued exactly as promised. The evidence survived. Additional witnesses came forward. Old records resurfaced. The truth could no longer be hidden. Garrett Voss faced the consequences of the actions that tied back to the decades-long cover-up surrounding the valley. The silence that protected the past had finally ended. But something more important had happened. The community had changed. The hidden families were no longer hidden. The survivors no longer feared coming home. People who spent years separated by secrets slowly found one another again. Conversations began. Memories returned. Healing started. And at the center of it all stood a ranch everyone once believed was worthless. Months passed. Summer became autumn. Autumn painted the mountains with gold and crimson. The ranch continued transforming. New fencing appeared. The barn received a proper roof. Volunteers helped restore the farmhouse. The vegetable gardens expanded. Animals arrived regularly. Abandoned horses, stray dogs, injured livestock, creatures with nowhere else to go. Mason accepted them all. The ranch became something larger than property, larger than land. It became a sanctuary, a place for second chances. Veterans struggling to find purpose visited. Families needing help found support. Children came to learn about animals. The laughter that once vanished from the valley returned. One evening, nearly a year after Mason's return, Ruth arrived carrying an old wooden box. The same box had remained hidden in her cabin for decades. She placed it on the farmhouse table. "I found something." Mason opened it carefully. Inside rested several photographs, old ranch records, handwritten notes, and one faded document that immediately caught his attention. A breeding registry, from before the wildfire. Mason frowned. "What is this?" Ruth smiled. "Keep looking." He studied the pages. Several names appeared repeatedly. Working dogs, ranch dogs, German shepherds, animals raised on the Reed property generations ago. Then he noticed something unusual. One bloodline continued through multiple entries. The records stretched across decades. Ruth pointed toward the final page. A name had been added years later. Titan's sire. Mason blinked, then looked again. The connection was unmistakable. His breath caught. "No." Ruth nodded. "Yes." The room fell silent. Even Emma looked emotional. Mason slowly lowered the paper. The realization felt impossible. Yet there it was. Documented. Verified. The bloodline that eventually produced Titan had originated on the Reed Ranch before the wildfire. Long before Mason ever met him. Long before military service. Long before everything. For a moment, nobody spoke. Titan lay near the fireplace, half asleep, content, peaceful. Mason stared at him. A strange warmth filled his chest. The old shepherd had spent weeks leading him home, finding clues, following trails, refusing to quit. Perhaps instinct had guided him, perhaps fate. Perhaps something neither man nor dog could fully understand. But somehow Titan had led them exactly where they needed to be. Back to the beginning. Back to home. Years later, visitors often asked Mason why he stayed. Why a man who had endured so much chose to spend the rest of his life rebuilding an old ranch in the mountains. His answer rarely changed. Sometimes he pointed toward the fields, sometimes toward the animals, sometimes toward the veterans working beside him. But most often he looked at Titan, the aging German shepherd who preferred sleeping on the porch at sunset. The loyal partner who never stopped believing there was something worth finding. On one quiet autumn evening, Mason sat beside Titan overlooking the valley. The sky blazed orange and gold. Wind moved gently through the grass. The ranch stretched beneath them. Alive, whole, home. Emma and Ruth laughed somewhere near the barn. Children fed rescued goats. Horses wandered peacefully through the pasture. The sounds of life filled every corner of the land. Mason rested a hand on Titan's shoulder. The shepherd leaned against him. Neither needed words. They had both spent years searching for purpose, searching for peace, searching for somewhere they truly belonged. The mystery was solved. The truth had survived. The ranch had been saved. But the greatest treasure had never been hidden documents or forgotten crimes. It was something simpler, a home worth returning to, a family worth protecting, a life worth rebuilding. As the sun disappeared behind the Bitterroot Mountains, Mason smiled. For 30 years, he thought the wildfire had taken everything. He was wrong. Because sometimes the road back to ashes leads somewhere unexpected. Sometimes it leads home. And thanks to one loyal dog who refused to give up, home had finally found them both. If you believe loyalty and perseverance still matter, comment 1 below. And if you've ever had to fight for something you loved, comment 0 and tell us where you're watching from. In the end, truth has a way of finding daylight, no matter how long it's been buried. And if stories about justice, dignity, and never giving up speak to you, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next journey.